Hello, I'm going to continue with yesterday's direction and start in the same place and then go to the same places. So we're going with Herman Daly again in link 1. Later in his article, in fact at the end, we find, of course, debt is incurred in exchange for real resources to be used now, which, as Soddy says, cannot be used again in the future. What he's saying there is you have capital and you give it to a project. That capital is no longer capital, it is debt. It is a debt instrument. But if the financed project can extract more resources, employing more labour in the future to increase the total revenue of society, then the debt can be paid off with interest and with some of the extra revenue left over as profit. Marvellous. But this requires an increased throughput of matter and energy and increased labour. In other words, it requires physical growth of the economy. Such growth in yesterday's empty world economy was reasonable. In today's full world economy it is not. It is now generally recognized that there is too much debt worldwide, both public and private. The reason so much debt was incurred is that we had absurdly unrealistic expectations about growth. We never expected that growth itself would begin to cost us more than it was worth, making us poorer, not richer. But it did. And the only solution our economists, bankers and politicians have come up with is more of the same. Could we not at least take a short time out to discuss the idea of a steady state economy? And that is Herman Daly's drive in life, to at least go to a steady state economy with a money system commensurate, as opposed to the growth-driven everything that we have now. So we'll go back again to the Arch Druid report and John Michael Greer, and later in his article that we read yesterday. In The Power of the Machine, Alf Hornberg has pointed out trenchantly that the industrial economy is at least as much a means of wealth concentration as it is one of wealth production. In the early days of the Industrial Revolution, when the hundreds and thousands of independent spinners and weavers, who had been the backbone of Britain's textile industry, were driven out of business by the mills of the English Midlands, the income that used to be spread among the latter went to a few mill owners and investors instead, with a tiny fraction reserved for the mill workers who tended the new machines at starvation wages. The same pattern expanded past a continental scale as spinners and weavers across much of the world were forced out of work by Britain's immense cloth export industry, and money that might have stayed in circulation in countries around the globe went instead into the pockets of English magnates. Right, we'll go on. What sets industrialism apart from other arbitrage schemes was that it arbitraged the price difference between different forms of energy. Concentrated heat energy in the form of burning fossil fuel was cheap, coal at the time. Mechanical energy in the form of complex movements performed by the hands of spinners and weavers was expensive. The steam engine and the machines it powered, such as the spinning jenny and power loom, turned concentrated heat into mechanical energy and opened the door to what must have been the most profitable arbitrage operation of all time. The gargantuan profits yielded by this scheme provided the start-up capital for further rounds of industrialization, and thus made possible the immense economic transformations of the industrial age. I'll just read on. That arbitrage, however, depended, as all arbitrage schemes do, on the price difference between the markets in question. In the case of industrialism, the difference was always fated to be temporary, because the low price of concentrated heat was purely a function of the existence of vast, unexploited reserves of fossil fuels that could easily be accessed by human beings. For obvious reasons, the most readily accessible reserves were mined or drilled first, and so, as time passed, production for fossil fuels, not to mention the many other natural materials needed for industrial projects, and thus necessary for the arbitrage operation to continue, went up. Slowly at first, and more dramatically in the last decade or so, so we've kind of caught up to the present day. So what I'm going to do is go back to the first paragraph I read you, the last paragraph in the daily article, and read it again, but the yellow bit. So we should get another view on this now. But the finance project can extract more if the finance project can extract more resources, employing more labour in the future to increase the total revenue of society, then the debt can be paid off with interest. Now, for that, where he says, but if the finance project can extract more resources, employing more labour, for labour we can use work in the more physics idea, as it might be physical labour, or it might be or physical work, or it might be work done by a fossil fuel energy source or a solar energy source, or whatever it might be. So, but if the finance project can extract more resources, employing more labour in the future to increase the total revenue of society, then the debt can be paid off with interest, and with some of the extra revenue left over as profit. But this requires an increased throughput of matter and energy. There's the link there. And increased labour. Increase is the important word, but everything is needed. There's resources needed, physical labour, mental labour, and energy. In other words, it requires physical growth of the economy. Such growth in yesterday's empty world was reasonable. In today's full world of world economy, it is not. Now, I'll come back to that. I'll finish reading. It is now generally recognized that there is too much debt worldwide, both public and private. The reason so much debt was incurred is that we had absurdly unrealistic expectations about growth. We never expected that growth itself would begin to cost us more than it was worth, making us poorer, not richer, but it did. Now what we have is capital being invested in arbitrage opportunities, bankable projects. But what these arbitrage opportunities, bankable projects have in common is what arbitrage is. It's a difference. It's exploitation, which is not in a pejorative term, but in an actual descriptive way. It's exploiting the difference between two things. Now, what I believe we're having in the world is, because of globalization, we are getting a more uniform everything. And there are less differences to exploit, meaning that bankable projects, arbitrage opportunities, the same thing, are fewer and fewer because of globalization. That is to get the increase on the money invested, which is essential. You invest the money to exploit a difference, but those differences are far harder to find, so the returns aren't coming back. And there's now a balance between, and probably there's some law that makes this balance happen. Energy now, as in fossil fuels, is balancing out labour costs. because it's gone up. It's Adam Smith's invisible hand that comes in a trillion different ways to balance these things up. If I can do it cheaper with a coal-fired this, I'll do it this way. If it's cheaper to employ 3 men to do it, I'll do that. And eventually you get a balance. And the more eventuallys and balances you get, the less arbitrage opportunities you get. And there might be more money out there, more wealth, more capital. But if it can't find arbitrage opportunities, the wealth will not get the interest that it craves. Right, so let's go again to the Financial Times and the interactive chart, and I've picked Commerzbank of Germany this time, and its main lending is to Germany. That's the biggest circle, but you can see the rest of the lending it has got out to just about all of Europe, going up through Lithuania, Latvia and Estonia, right over to Portugal and Spain, down to Greece, and a lot in Italy. These are assets on the Commerzbank's books, and because of the growth flattening out, they are not getting the returns they need, and this is why the German taxpayer will be going in there, maybe even before the end of the year, to what is called bail them out. Financial Times gives us the Sarko and Corzine trade. Now this is, you know who Corzine is. Anyway, the following raised some eyebrows in the FT newsroom on Friday. This was after Sarko opened his mouth after the meeting. French President Nicolas Sarkozy said the ECB's increased provision of funds meant governments in countries like Italy and Spain could look to their country's banks to buy their bonds. This means that each state can turn to its banks, which will have liquidity at their disposal, Sarko told reporters. So, banks, liquidity, what's it all about? And the small paragraph tries to tell us. Very briefly, we think the Sarko trade would run as follows. Eurozone Bank, Commerzbank, what did we have yesterday? Forget which bank it was. But any of them, all of them, borrows 3-year money, that's one of the new provisions from the ECB, at a set rate, 1%, very low, from the ECB after putting up acceptable collateral. As luck would have it, sovereign debt is very acceptable, so they buy, say, short-dated Italian debt at, say, 4%, pledge the asset immediately to the ECB for the money that they've just borrowed, although with a graduated ECB haircut for credit risk, so there's a slight difference, they have to put up slightly more capital, and pocket the difference between the ECB's lending rate, 1%, and the yield on the sovereign bond, 4%. Retained earnings at the banks improve, the sovereign has a buyer for its debt, and the ECB is playing its role in solving the crisis. A certain carry trade is back to the fore. Everyone's a winner. And that's the end. And we ask, is everyone a winner? And now we know that there'd only be a winner if that money going to the governments is in being invested in something that it's going to increase, but it requires increased throughput of matter and energy and increased labour. Such growth is what's needed in the world today, and all that sort of stuff from Daily. And will that money going to the governments go into those sorts of projects? Has the past 30 years gone into those sort of projects? Can we expect those debt instruments to be not just the interest, but the principal paid back? And I think we've got to say probably not. But the most important take from this presentation is that arbitrage opportunities are exploitation of differences. Globalization is equalizing everything, and those differences are harder to find now. So investment, capital investment, is not profitable. Try again tomorrow. Bye.